times. The Children's Caucus is a bipartisan, bicameral legislative committee that is committed to working together to address some of the most serious issues facing children in Ohio today. When the caucus was created, no one had any idea of the challenges we would soon face. We now find ourselves going through something for which we have no roadmap, no experience, and it often appears no good choices. Unlike never before, it is critically important that we arm ourselves with the knowledge we need and the willingness to work together to assure that our children make it through this pandemic as physically and emotionally healthy as possible. By providing you the opportunity to hear from those on the front lines of this crisis, we strive to provide the best hope for the children and families of Ohio as we work our way towards a new normal. Our webinar today continues the discussion about education equity while reopening Ohio schools. One issue that has really been exposed by the COVID crisis is the lack of equity when it comes to technology in our schools. While some of our schools were able to fairly smoothly transition to online learning in a matter of weeks, far too many of our children received virtually no instruction from March on. Lacking computers and/or adequate broadband and the skills to use them, students were further handicapped by teachers who had absolutely no idea how to teach an online course. With several months of preparation behind us and our eyes wide open to the challenge before us, are our schools better prepared to address these inequalities than they were 5 months ago? To address this question, we have 3 panelists to offer you today. First will be Melissa Cropper, President of the American Federation of Teachers. Following Melissa, we have John Richards, the Deputy State Superintendent, and Peter Voderberg, Chief of Broadband Ohio, Development Service Agency. Let me remind you that legislators and their staff will have the opportunity to ask questions at the conclusion of the presentations. All other callers will remain muted. Melissa, perhaps you could start off by providing an overview from the teacher's perspective of the needs in policy and funding from the federal, state, and local level for schools reopening in Ohio.
Thank you, Senator Lander. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this today and for even holding this webinar, because I think it is such a critical topic for us all to be discussing. I am Melissa Cropper, President of the Ohio Federation of Teachers. Not quite at the American Federation of Teachers yet, but I am a VP. I am a Vice President of the American Federation of Teachers. And certainly the past few months, our teachers, our educators as a whole, have found themselves dealing with a much more complex situation than we ever imagined that we'd have to deal with. And it's been further complicated by just the lack of certainty about what the future holds. What is the beginning of school going to look like? And I feel like we've had a lot of time and effort the past few weeks put into looking at what does a hybrid model look like, how can we safe distance in school, all these other really critical pieces. Now to just find out that a lot of our schools are actually going to be going all virtual the first part of the year. So now there really is kind of this flip to thinking about, okay, now that we're going all remote, let's put all our energies into what does it look like to do complete remote learning, rather than spending so much time trying to figure out how are we making the school environment safe, and how are we spreading students out, how are we allocating our resources within the school. But obviously we still have that going on in places too. So wherever you are in the state, the scenario is different. And that's part of what makes it all so complex and so difficult. I appreciate that you pointed out the inequity of technology and not just devices, but actually broadband access. That is certainly one of the inequities that needs to be addressed. And when we're talking about what we need from federal, state, local level, I mean, it is both having devices, having PD on how to use the devices and having that broadband internet connection. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't point out that this situation has also highlighted a lot of other inequities in our system and things that we might not even typically think about in the realm of education, but things that very much do impact how children learn in schools. So the lack of rental assistance, if rental assistance runs out, then what does that do to our children and where they're living? And how does that impact our ability to reach them, find them, make sure they are being able to access learning? Food insecurity, how are we going to continue to feed children when they're not in school? And even during the times if they are in school, food insecurity outside of the school hours impacts a child's ability to learn. Money for access to health and health insurance, all those pieces, very critical to how a child is able to learn. So I think it's important as we're going through this crisis that we think of it all in the context of the complete child, everything that impacts the child, and not just like, what does it look like to get a child back into a school building, or what does it look like to make sure a child has access to remote learning, because all those other pieces are equally as important, if not more important, to a child's ability to succeed. So when we think about in those aspects, I mean, when we're looking at federal needs, we very much believe that we need the HEROES Act passed at the federal level. The HEROES Act allows for $2.1 billion for K-12 education. That's targets the money to our most disadvantaged schools, and allows for those funds to be used for PPE, infrastructure improvement, supplies, additional staffing, devices, all these things that we know that we need to safely reopen schools. It also provides resources for all those other things that I just mentioned that are really critical, such as rental assistance, child nutrition programs, broadband, unemployment insurance so that families still have money to live on, FMAP, rural health care. All those pieces are a critical part of what we need from a federal level. Looking at a state level, again, it all comes down to funding often. I think we need to make sure that we keep in mind that prior to this pandemic, we were underfunded. So we were 2 years having our funding foundation frozen. And then as we got into this, another $300 million cut from education. And that creates a new baseline for next year. So our schools are already starting next year with a different baseline for funding at a time when we actually need increased funding for our schools. We need to make sure that we have that adequate staffing, regardless of what type of setting that we're in. If we're going back into buildings, we need more nurses, we need more custodial staff, we need more teachers, because if we're safely social distancing students, we need to figure out how we're making sure those students are covered. We need the paraprofessionals. All these people are critical. We also, it's estimated, some estimates have been done, that it would actually cost approximately $2,300 per student to safely reopen schools. So those are some of the things that we're obviously looking at. And then another thing that could happen at a state level is, again, funding for some of those other things that I've mentioned. So that remaining CARES Act money that's out there could do things like provide for food bank assistance, rental assistance, utility assistance, et cetera. And then as far as just policy, I think that there are some things that, again, you might not necessarily think of as important for reopening schools, but although the first one definitely is, I think we do need to have some kind of statewide policy on when schools can provide face-to-face instruction. Like I said, right now it is all over the place, and there's really no consistency in how it's decided whether someone's going to go back, whether they're doing blended, whatever. I would like for us to see us implement some kind of policy that says, if you are in a red or purple county, you are not reopening schools until you are out of that danger zone. Or something that that says schools aren't going to open until after September 1st. So that's, we can spend time preparing for the virtual learning, et cetera, have teachers come back earlier and prepare for that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And we have schools starting at the same time instead of this wide variance that we're currently seeing. Another policy, which again goes to the funding piece, would be investment in broadband. We've stated that quite a bit. But another thing I think we really need to be thinking about critically is protection for workers, for those people who are going into the schools every day, whether it's teachers, bus drivers, custodians. We need to make sure that they have reasonable accommodations. So if they're in a high-risk category, or if they live with someone who's in a high-risk category, that we can figure out ways they can continue to do the jobs that they want to do without having to put their lives or the lives of people they love in jeopardy. We need to do something about guaranteed sick time. We know that it's very possible that if we're in schools and our teachers and paraprofessionals and others are exposed to the virus, they could be quarantined multiple times throughout the year. So how do we make sure that they still have sick leave that they can use throughout that time, and they're not being penalized some way? We also need to make sure that we have a commitment to equity to take care of all the things that we've been talking about. And then policy-wise, the last thing I'll say is I think we need to really take this as an opportunity to create some alignment about what we've learned our schools really do and how important they are in the daily lives of our students and how accountability is being measured in this state. I think one thing that this pandemic has shown is that our students are so dependent upon schools for much more than just learning. They're dependent upon them for food, dependent upon them for safety. There's just a lot of ways that schools play a role in children's lives that they're not necessarily being credited for doing. So I think as we think about, the ODE has been so good about putting out the plan that talks about the whole child. I think now the time is coming to look at how does our accountability system reflect taking care of the whole child. So I'll leave it at that for now and let other people chime in with their responses.
Thank you so much, Melissa. You certainly have provided a pretty extensive list. It's kind of scary in a lot of ways, but I think it's the reality of the situation, and we have to deal with it. John, would you like to, at this point, answer the same question, sort of based on the perspective of the Department of Ed, and anything you'd like to share? Go ahead, John.
Sure. Thank you so much, Senator. And always have to remind myself to take myself off mute. In the chat box, I just actually put a link to the Department of Education's Reset and Restart plan. And as I'm going to talk a bit through that today. And so if we could actually move to the next slide, what I'm going to do is talk briefly about the Reset Restart plan and then get into some of the challenges that we see as well. Certainly today, and if you could go ahead and jump to the next slide, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the current context is I think everybody was kind of excited when the governor announced kind of what the guidance would be in terms of coming back to school. And we had been working for about 6 weeks on what that guidance would look like. And everybody was relatively excited about that. And over the past 4 weeks, as Melissa stated, we're now seeing, of course, our numbers not looking so good. And as a result, many different local departments of health have recommended for their counties to go back either in a 100% remote environment or something close to that. So briefly, I'll mention that the Reset and Restart Planning Guide that we put out has a link to the Ohio Department of Health guidance in it. So that was kind of one major piece of our Reset Restart guidance. Probably what's more important at this point than the guidance that kind of spells out the basics of what's expected from a health perspective, but also then many considerations for districts and schools to take into account as students return in whatever fashion they return in, is then a dedicated webpage of resources. And so we have both national resources on our webpage, and we also have other departments within the state, as well as a few examples of Ohio resources, in particular in the areas of language arts and math, reading, writing types of issues. And then finally, I think what we found ourselves in, and we're attempting to be as purposeful as possible, is just kind of playing the role of convener and allowing for networking to take place. We've been working with our major education associations, as well as going into virtually every meeting that we can, if we get invites, just to talk through the issues that people are experiencing kind of as they think about returning to school. So if we could go to the next slide, some of the important principles, I'm not listing all of them, that are really critical as schools and districts are making final plans and decisions. I think the first two bullets really sum up the way we've put things together, and that is flexibility and nimbleness. And by flexibility, what that means is we can't have one size fits all. We were really happy to be aligned with the Departments of Health and the Governor's Office when the guidance came out in terms of allowing for local control, and you now see that playing itself out with the designations by color coding in each county. I think even to drill down deeper, we're getting a lot of feedback about, you know, can we tie that more to zip code? Because in a place, let's pick out southeastern Ohio, and you've got Athens County, you might have a really small school with virtually no issues of the virus in it, but most of the virus numbers are coming from Athens City. And so does, you know, this school system over here have to close its doors because most of these are coming from Athens City? So we're getting a lot of those types of questions coming to both us and the Department of Health right now as well. The other key principle in this is that of nimbleness, and that is adjusting very, very quickly. Today we might be open and tomorrow we might be closed. Of course, that all hit school districts across the state very quickly in March. I think now we are in a better place than certainly we were in March or even April, as you know, we've done a lot of professional development. We still have a lot to go. But as a system in Ohio, we are in a better spot now than certainly we would have been. I think as we're seeing these numbers play out and local health departments being involved, that we do understand that we are going to have to be extremely nimble over these next months and perhaps the better part of the upcoming school year. An important component then when you get beyond kind of those logistics is just how important it is to meet each student where he or she is. That's my reminder. I've got about a minute left. And the importance of supporting educators in that process. As Melissa and the Senator both mentioned, throughout our entire document, as well as Ohio's strategic plan for education, there's a very high focus on equity, and a part of that is effectively communicating. So this leads to a few of the challenges that we see in front of us on the next slide. And those challenges, I think, first and foremost, while maybe it sounds kind of interesting, but it's operations and logistics. You know, we have not been here before. And as you see different plans come through across the state on remote learning or kind of a flexible learning approach, that, you know, there is great need on the operations side of our school districts and on everything from scheduling to those giving full online options in addition to in-person, how they can staff those, and so forth. So there's a lot of detail underneath that bullet. Equity, of course, and especially in a remote environment. I was in another meeting about an hour ago. We had a superintendent from Northwest Ohio who kept cutting in and out because of the broadband issues, and he had to drive to a certain location both for cell service and for adequate internet service so that he could actually stay in our meeting. That is playing itself out, not as much as it was, but still so in districts statewide. We have a very, very high concern about those students, especially when we're in a remote environment, who become disengaged. That is really extremely critical that we keep students, and especially those who are at higher risk, engaged in what's happening. And then, of course, again, I know Melissa won't fight back on this, the absolute necessity of supporting our educators out there, our teachers, our building administrators, again, because this is still relatively new for everyone, and somebody who was teaching in classroom for the last 25 years and suddenly is going to an entirely remote type of situation. There is a lot of new learning that's required for educators as well as for our students. So with that, I will end my time. And I'm really excited to hear Peter speak next, because he's deeply involved in some of the equity issues that both Melissa and I have mentioned. So Senator, back to you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, John. We appreciate all the work you're doing. Peter, as Melissa so accurately pointed out, technology issues are only one of the issues of equity that we're facing. However, it's probably one of the most immediate needs that we have, because literally it's a question of schools opening or not opening here in the next month or so. So if you'd like to pick up from there and tell us what Broadband Ohio is doing to address the issue of technology equity.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation today. As the senator said, my name is Peter Voderberg. I am Chief of Broadband Ohio, which is a new division inside of the Development Services Agency. And I'm going to talk to you first a little bit about what our administration has done to date, and then some of the things and plans we have moving forward to be able to address the broadband inequalities that are happening in the state. So the DeWine Husted administration has been taking a very deliberate and methodical approach to tackling the broadband challenges facing the state. Right away, Innovate Ohio was established to streamline government processes and bring innovation to governance. Connected Nation Ohio was provided a grant of nearly $1 million from the Third Frontier to improve upon our outdated coverage maps for the state. And an RFI was released in June of 2019, seeking input on how to best leverage state assets in expanding broadband. Ultimately, that led to the state's first broadband strategy, which was released in December of last year. The major categories of that strategy are telehealth, a statewide grant, regulatory reform, economic development and entrepreneurial activities, digital literacy, rights of way, and an office of broadband. For telehealth, we are working on telehealth solutions to connect people with healthcare providers and leverage those efforts to expand access to our communities. As for the statewide grant, we are working with our friends in the legislature on House Bill 13, which provides money to internet service providers to assist them in reaching unserved and underserved areas in the state. On regulatory reform, we've created a streamlined online permitting process through the Ohio Department of Transportation for access to non-interstate rights-of-way to maintain consistency in how people interact with the state when they want to lay fiber. We are also working with the industry to identify key regulatory issues that stand in the way of broadband expansion. Economic development and entrepreneurial activities is just kind of a long-winded way of saying that we are working with Jobs Ohio to invest in companies that are investing in the state and in our communities that need help. For digital literacy, we have just begun working with the Ohio Library Council on digital literacy programs so that people understand how to use the technology and how it can fit into their lives. For rights of way, we are finalizing a statewide interstate rights of way access plan so that companies can work with a single entity from one side of the state to the other on broadband installation. And lastly, during the RFI process and beyond, we've heard from numerous providers and stakeholders that they would like to have a point of contact in the administration that focused on broadband issues. As a result, Broadband Ohio, my office, was created, an office that is a one-stop shop to work on connectivity issues day in and day out. Broadband Ohio is dedicated to two principles. The first is bringing high-speed internet access to every Ohioan. That doesn't mean that every Ohioan needs to sign up for access. But we want to make sure that no matter where you live, you will have at least one provider who gives internet. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry, I heard somebody. It doesn't mean that every Ohioan wants to have internet access, but we want to make sure that no matter where you live, you will have at least one provider who gives internet speeds that meet the federal definition of high speed. that's currently 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. The second is building a best-in-class broadband network in Ohio. That doesn't mean that Ohio wants to own the network. What it means is that the service is reliable and dependable wherever you happen to live in the state. Broadband Ohio is technology and provider neutral. We're interested in innovators and new ways of getting internet into the homes. Our broadband expansion package of initiatives supports public-private collaboration, requires state and local buy-in, and values community involvement. And we know that during this pandemic, many students had no way to connect to the internet from home to be able to do schoolwork, talk to their teachers, or continue their education. School districts did a phenomenal job of trying to keep those students engaged through take-home packets, sending home technology, or even putting Wi-Fi hotspots on buses to drive them through areas that lack internet access. This pandemic has shown a light on the digital divide between people who are able to connect and those who cannot. There are two main issues that keep people from being connected. One is availability, and the other is access. Availability is the ability to have internet access in your home. Large parts of Appalachia, including some urban and suburban areas, have no internet providers at all and lack availability. Access is the ability to connect to the internet once it is available. In many areas, even where the internet is readily available, it may not be affordable, or the home may not have a device to connect. To tackle these issues, Broadband Ohio has numerous initiatives currently underway. For availability, and you've heard me say it already, we are working on House Bill 13 to bring internet connectivity to areas that do not have it. House Bill 13 provides a grant for the difference between the amount of money that is expected on a return on investment and the money that needs to be there to make the investment. Stated a different way, if a company comes in and says that they need to make, $3 million over the course of the next 5 years to be profitable, but they think they can only make $2 million, they can come to the grant authority and say, for the difference of the $1 million, we would be able to provide internet to these unserved and underserved areas. That legislation has already passed the Ohio House and is in the Ohio Senate right now. I believe it's had its first hearing, but I'm not sure if it's had its second. We also have a telehealth pilot project, which is focused on behavioral health, that is in Monroe County with the Switzerland of Ohio School District. For those of you who don't know the school district, it's very large, in Appalachia of over 500 square miles. It encompasses 8 separate and distinct buildings. Now, the goal of this administration has been to make sure that every child has access to behavioral health services. And what was happening in Monroe County is that because these buildings are so far apart, it could take a therapist between 35 and 45 minutes to drive from one building to the other. So they'd be in one building providing regular health checks to the students that are there, and then be called to a child who is in crisis in another building. They'd have to leave, travel to 35 minutes to provide the crisis intervention before having to travel 35 minutes back. In one story, we heard that a therapist left the building that she was currently serving students in to go to a crisis intervention, provided that intervention, got in her car to drive back to see if she could see any other students. And because Monroe County has such limited cell phone service, it took her 25 minutes before she could receive the messages from the building she had just left, asking her to turn around and provide another crisis intervention. So that therapist lost 50 minutes of travel time because there was no cell phone service and she had to just drive from one place and then back. So the way that we're going to tackle this problem is that in phase 1, it will allow a therapist in any one of those buildings in Monroe County to be able to talk to any other building in the county. Basically, because the state of Ohio has a robust statewide network called OrNet, each school building has a relatively high-speed internet connection that is very robust and can handle the kinds of communication needs that you need to be able to provide telehealth. So when they're in one building, instead of driving 35 minutes where they're outside of cell phone coverage, they'll instead be able to provide an intervention from one building to another and make a determination as if they actually need to provide an in-face service or whether they can de-escalate those situations right away. We're hoping to have that phase 1 be finished before the end of this year. Phase 2 will allow the therapist to communicate from their office to the school or even to a home. At the beginning of this process, if you can believe it, this announcement actually happened on the day that the governor announced the first COVID cases in the state. And so some of the project that we have been talking about has been pivoting. We have always desired that the increase in connectivity to the provider and to the schools would benefit the community by increasing additional connectivity there. But now we're talking about working with the school to make sure that whatever solution we choose will have the most impact on making sure that more people in Monroe County have access to the internet by virtue of us increasing access both to the school system and to the provider. We're also creating a blueprint, which is a working document that will help other school districts create a telehealth program that works for them. And we're also creating the metrics for future programs. We're looking at how we want schools to report on these type of programs to measure success. We know that there will be an increase in children receiving services in these school districts, and we want to see how that impacts other measures, such as detentions or behavioral incidents or other metrics that we're still determining. The other part is access. From an access perspective, this administration last week announced two very important initiatives. The first is a request for information that was released to the Department of Administrative Services to create a transparent price list for technology in the state of Ohio. We had heard from numerous school districts and superintendents that one of the problems that they faced is that now they are requiring to buy technology. They didn't know what providers may actually have the ability to provide them with services. What the state's doing is leveraging its own position to ask those providers to provide as much independent information as they can on what education pricing they have available, so that school districts will be able to go online, look at the individual price lists, and make a determination for that district as to what technology they may want to buy to increase connectivity for their school district. The other is a $50 million grant that we are very appreciative that the legislature's controlling board approved this Monday that will allow ODE to give money to school districts to be able to purchase connectivity devices. Now, when we say connectivity devices, most people are thinking to themselves hotspots or cellular-enabled tablets. But here again, we are being flexible. If a school district wants to have an enterprise-wide solution where they work with Charter Communications or Caucus Communications or CenturyLink or any other in-home provider like even Cincinnati Bell, then they can utilize this program to be able to provide at-home internet connectivity as long as it's a school district that's doing it. It will also allow school districts to purchase hotspots or cellular-enabled tablets if they need to make sure that their students have connectivity in the home and they have a cellular network. Now, some of the school districts we know don't actually have a robust enough cellular network in most of the county to be able to provide those services to their students. So we're also going to allow school districts to do things like either increase public Wi-Fi by purchasing public Wi-Fi hotspots where they can broadcast to their own parking lots, or even work with other local community centers to be able to broadcast Wi-Fi into those parking lots so that students can come and at least have some internet connectivity. And as I mentioned before, there are some school districts that are putting hotspots onto buses using amplifiers to be able to grab weak cell phone signals and still be able to broadcast into a community. If a school district thinks that's the best path forward, being able to provide internet, then we will allow that for the grant as well. And we're also open to new ideas. There's a lot of new technology that's coming out every day. And if a school district knows of a way to be able to increase the amount of connectivity to their school district, they can utilize this grant. And we're looking to do more. As I said, this pandemic has shown how severe the digital divide can be. We want to make sure that our most vulnerable populations, especially those school children who don't have access to connectivity, stay connected to work from home, receive healthcare from home, and learn from home. I look forward to continuing to work with you to help keep our communities connected both during this pandemic and beyond. And again, thank you very much for allowing me to speak today.
Peter, that was an incredible presentation, and I'm sure everyone learned a lot. We're going to need to hear a lot more from you, I think, in the weeks ahead. I'm going to turn things over at this point to the co-chair of the Children's Caucus, Allison Russo. Representative Russo, are you there?
I am here. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Lehner, and thank you to our wonderful panelists who have been presenting today. I just want to say before we open up for questions, certainly from our legislators who have joined or their staff, and I see we have a number of comments and questions in the chat as well. We were having part one of this conversation 3 weeks ago, and I think the comments by John about flexibility and nimbleness, if we think about some of the conversations we were having 3 weeks ago with schools and school districts and how quickly things have changed in even a matter of 3 weeks for many of these same school districts and school districts across the state, just further emphasizes how going into this new school year, we really are going to have to think about how do we best prepare school districts and teachers and families with the resources needed to be flexible and nimble as we work our way through this new school year. So I did want to open it up initially to, I know we've got a number of legislators who have joined, and if those folks have questions, but our colleagues have questions, go ahead and take yourself off of mute and you can just ask the question. Try to direct your question maybe to a specific panelist if you can, or one or two of the panelists. That would be helpful as well. Anyone? All right. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat box, but I do want to ask, Peter, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot just a little bit, and you
Sure.
mentioned this, the grant that was announced, and I think it was $50 million that was announced in the school district. One of and I don't know if you said this earlier, but it also requires a 50% match from the school district. And so as we think about these equity issues, particularly in some areas of the state, maybe the school districts that may most be in need of this grant, have there been conversations about how do we make sure those school districts, often who have high numbers of children families living in poverty, have a very low tax base and may not be able to come up with that 50% matching fund? Is there a way to ensure that we're really getting these monies and these grants directly to those school districts who need this grant most and need these resources, have the most need?
Sure. So we've had a lot of input since the announcement of people asking that question about the one-to-one match. I know that people have offered a lot of suggestions ranging from a sliding scale to make sure that some of the more impoverished communities might have an opportunity to participate at a higher level, to a waiver of the requirement. And the parameters for the grant are not released yet. Obviously, otherwise ODE would be with me today saying what the grant parameters are. So I want to say that those are ongoing conversations about what that match is going to look like. And as the parameters evolve, or as that one-to-one match happens, we'll continue to have that conversation about what we can do to help those communities make sure that they can tap into the resources that they need. So, but it has been brought up that there have been conversations about that, and they are ongoing as we finalize the parameters for the grant.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for speaking to that. I appreciate that.
Sure.
So unless some of our colleagues have decided that they do have a question, Pete has asked a question in the chat, asking really a question of the legislators that are on the call. What is the legislature willing to do to provide more funding to support both effective online and safe in-person school in an equitable way? It's good that the state has some CARES money to distribute, and more may come from the federal government, but what about the state? When will we tap into the rainy day fund, and should the legislature consider raising new revenue? And then references a report by Policy Matters about some potential new sources of revenue. I'll take a stab at this first. I think without a doubt, we will be facing critical revenue shortfalls, certainly going into the next budget cycle, but even the remainder of this budget cycle. And, I think the reality is there's going to be very little state money, extra money to tap into. I am of the opinion that, we may need to make some very difficult decisions about looking at how do we perhaps make our tax code more equitable. But on the flip side of that, also, should we be using money from the rainy day fund for this? And I think it's inevitable that we absolutely will be using that. And I don't know if Senator Lehner, you want to add to this.
Yeah, I would just say, I've heard the governor say repeatedly that he expects there to be little or nothing left of the rainy day fund by the time we get through this crisis. And rather than spend that right up front when we knew we had a shortfall, to have a better sense of how big the shortfall was going to be and where it was going to go, made sense to him. So I don't think the rainy day fund is going to be a question for much debate down the road here at all. It will be gone.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up and say, I agree that it's not going to be the panacea and the full answer, just because of the enormous amount of money that we're talking about, not only in the education sector, but really across some of our budget needs. And certainly as we're going into the next General Assembly, some very difficult decisions that I think we will have to make as legislators, especially in the education space.
Right.
So Representative Lightbody, I see you've got a question here that you put in the chat. Do you want to take yourself off mute and ask the question?
So I'm off mute. I actually posted two. One of them was about what we need to do. This might be a question for Melissa Cropper. What is it we need to do to help our high needs students, so those who have disabilities, whether they're special needs kids who normally would be getting help from special ed tutors and educators in the schools. That's hard for parents to provide that. They felt, I know, really challenged through the spring. So that was a question that I had. If either of you want to provide some feedback on what you know has been done and what kind of supports are in place to help families and the schools meet the needs of our high needs special needs kids.
So Melissa, if you don't mind, I'll maybe say a few comments first.
I think that's appropriate. Yes, thank you.
Of course you do. So first thing I'll say is, by and large, the individual education plans, the IEPs, do drive services that are required for students with disabilities. So we're talking about these students. And while certainly in the environment in which we were operating this spring, that presented many, many challenges, we are ultimately responsible for educating those children. And so in many cases, that might mean extra support even after a school year or through the summer. My guess is post-pandemic, when we're in whatever a normal might look like at that point, we will probably be providing additional time for those students who maybe missed out. At the same time, we are working, because this is, of course, driven by federal legislation and requirements, we're working to make sure we are in total alignment with the expectations through this time period. And as a result of that, we will be putting out some additional guidance on the webpage that I put in the chat box. We anticipate that coming out probably in the next week or so, before most districts are back. And in particular, in this time period where it does look like we're going to have a lot of districts starting remotely or in some type of blended environment, this is going to be really critical once again that districts and schools across the state are addressing this. We also understand the reality that in a remote environment, we can't have educators everywhere that we would like them to be, and in some cases, this requires more of a one on one type situation or very small numbers to accomplish what's needed here. It's one of our larger challenges, to be quite frank, and it's also an equity issue in particular for this group of students. So we will be providing as many resources as possible. It's also a challenge obviously at the district level. So Melissa, do you want to add to that?
I really don't have anything to add to that. It's a great answer. It certainly was one of the most common questions we got asked last spring, one of the biggest concerns that was raised. And I think the difficult question to try to figure out is, how do we create the flexibility to do the work remotely without sacrificing the needs of the student? And that's something that all of us are looking at and trying to figure out. But I appreciate the help from the department.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Lightbody, for that question. I see that we have Lynn from Broadband Ohio who is on, and she's put a couple of questions in, but I think this one is important, and I think, John, you probably will be answering this one, but Melissa, you may want to weigh in as well. How are we supporting districts to work in partnership with childcare at the local and state level so that teachers and families can work, and while children are in safe and quality learning environments? Certainly we know that many teachers are also parents themselves, sometimes with children that are both in school as well as younger children who may be in preschool. John, maybe can you speak to, has there been talk and coordination on the childcare front, which sometimes will fall under ODJFS and not ODE, depending on the center? Have there been conversations in this space?
So absolutely, this is a question we get virtually every day. So there are a lot of conversations taking place. The governor, of course, just announced the ratios that we're able to, I guess, depending how you look at increase, that allows for more students in the child care settings. We just announced today a special State Board of Education meeting on August 10th to address this issue, because our rules around child care that are operated by our education, by our schools, to be in alignment with the this set of rules and the ratios that go with them. So that will be in front of our state board in a week and a half or so. So that will offer a bit of relief as well. The other thing I will mention is that we, because of this being an issue and it plays itself out very locally, we have met with all of kind of the major education unions and associations. Melissa was part of that meeting, in which, to the extent that we can influence school districts and those leaders to work with their staffs and be as flexible, again, going back to that word, as flexible as possible through this type of an environment, we are encouraging that to play itself out in local memorandums of understandings, their collective bargaining units, collective bargaining agreements, and so forth. So again, I don't know if Melissa, if you would add anything to that. You were part of a few of those conversations.
Once again, John, you gave a very complete answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, you know, as someone who has 2 school-age children and one who is actually in preschool, I found it amazing that many of the teachers, my children's own teachers, were not only teaching their own children, having their own children who were going through remote learning, and pivoting very quickly, but also sometimes, like me, also had very small children at home during that time when the child care centers were closed. So it's an issue that impacts so many of us, but especially our teachers as well. I did want to move to Tim Johnson. Has written broadband access is important. HB 13 is a good start to build up the infrastructure for Ohioans who can't access broadband. But what are we going to do for those who have access but cannot afford broadband? Utilities like electricity and gas have programs like PIPP and HEAP, but what is there for low-income Ohioans who find broadband too expensive? And maybe Peter, you can talk about this, and I don't know if that's part of some of the grant that was announced last week for the school districts, if that will help to address some of this. But those families that they have access to broadband, but it's an affordability issue, and maybe some of the programs that are happening with some of the providers as well.
Sure. So the from an access perspective, the $50 million that we're talking about with the school districts is definitely targeted at making sure that we have all those children have access. So for some of them, access exists because they are otherwise in poverty. They may be on free or reduced lunch, or be below the poverty level in some other way, or even alternatively, they just may not have connectivity because they're in a place that doesn't have connectivity at all. And so that $50 million is to go to school districts to be able to address that issue for those students, to be able to make sure that those students have a way to access the internet, even if they're in areas that may otherwise have relatively robust internet coverage. It's to make sure that those students can still be online from their homes. When it comes to an effort like the PIPP or the HEAP program, to my knowledge right now, the federal government is having conversations about what Lifeline may look like in the future, and the possibility of using that for internet service to the home. We are beginning to have conversations about what increased access will look like. Obviously, all across the state, there are very different problems, right? We have the Appalachian region and some very urban regions that don't have any internet access or any internet availability. And so even if you have a device, you can't connect. But then, like you said, there are some students and some people, other places that don't have the ability to tap in because of another barrier that may stand in their way, whether it be financial or some other reason. It may even be that they don't know how to use the technology. And that's why the broadband strategy is tackling this issue not just from the perspective of making sure that availability exists, but making sure that we do everything from digital literacy to help educate people how to use devices so that they may be able to use them in their homes. Also, we are working on some specific programs. The telehealth initiative that we're talking about may result in people getting additional internet access, but other telehealth initiatives that we have been approached about include doing things to make sure that people have access to devices in their homes where they may not have it otherwise. So in doing all these things together, there's no one solution that's going to work for any one area of the state. But by putting all of these solutions together, we'll be able to craft solutions for all across Ohio to make sure that where you are, you both have access and availability. You both have the ability to call a provider. And if you're, especially in one of these vulnerable populations, there will be programs that we're trying to put together to make sure that you have access to a device to help you. So.
Thank you, Peter. I did want to ask a question. Jack Lynch, who's from Hannah News, he has a question for John, and but would be interested to hear from the other panelists as well. So the question is, any thoughts on how state tests will be administered next year or any other accountability measures for online education?
Yeah, so I'm happy to respond with what we know today. And that's the first thing that we probably should say. What we know today is that we are planning to move forward with assessments for accountability purposes. This has been a clear message that has come from the federal level, which again drives this space. How that will be delivered, we are waiting to hear what some options might be. Again, if you look across the country, this is increasingly becoming evident that it's going to need to be addressed. There is probably much concern that we may not be able to provide testing in an in-person manner or within the windows that are planned for this testing. And again, hoping that both the flexibility and the nimbleness that we're calling for here in Ohio, we hope to see that maybe played out at the federal level when it comes to these assessments that are required. And so we are in a bit of a wait and see mode in terms of will that remain or will there be some relief from those assessments. Secondly, if they do remain in place as requirements, then what that plays itself out like in a blended or remote environment. I'm sure there will be more to come on that. So it's an answer that right now we don't know how that will play itself out if the pandemic continues in the kind of the path it's been on these past several weeks.
John, this is Senator Lehner. Can I just pop in here and ask you, has there been any consideration given to sort of changing the focus of the testing, not so much to be measuring schools and teachers, et cetera, but be measuring the loss of learning that has taken place? I think until we know how many months of learning kids have lost, we aren't going to really know how to remediate that. And that seems to me far more critical at this point than trying to figure out whether or not a particular teacher's getting something accomplished.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. And I can't speak for the conversations that are happening necessarily at the federal level. What I can say is that has been a big concern. I think we've been kind of careful trying not to use the word loss too much, only because we don't want students to feel like somehow they've done something wrong. But you'll notice even on one of the bullets in my slide deck, we talked about meeting students where they are. So we do have some resources that we have available and are increasing actually to assist with that. Our Office of Assessment shifted a lot of its work over the early summer to focus on what can we get into educators' hands in terms of helping them assess where students are in especially those critical subjects that we know are part of the federal assessments as well, but in particular in the area of math and English language arts. We've put some tools together that we can use at the classroom level to help assess where students are. It's a great question, and happy to say that at least in our state, we're addressing that. And that also came from a lot of input from our teachers' organizations, people who are kind of on the ground out, in the field saying, we need some support in this area.
Senator Laner, I'll chime in on this also, because I'm glad you asked that question, because it kind of goes back to what I was saying in my opening about making sure we're aligning our accountability system with what our students actually need. And I think finding out where our students stand at this point in time and using assessments for that purpose and using the results of those assessments to drive what we need to do this upcoming year and years to come is very appropriate. The problem is the way our accountability system is set up now. If we continue to do those tests that are required by the federal government, there are all kinds of consequences that are attached to the results of those tests. So we're going to be in a situation where we're teaching in very complex situations where we're maybe in school some weeks, out of school other weeks, doing remote learning, doing face-to-face, maybe not the best teacher teaching the students because of having to social distance. So people might be teaching on other subject areas, and we're going to test, and the results may not be what we'd like for them to be. But as a result, a school may become eligible for vouchers, or a teacher's evaluation is going to be negatively impacted. All those negative consequences that we really should not be wasting our time being concerned about right now. We should be assessing where students are, what do we need to do to help them, how do we move them forward.
And I know we only have a minute left here, but I would agree, Melissa, that our focus more than anything else, as it always should be directly on our students and what we're doing for our students. And I think many of the questions that are, frankly, questions we can't answer today, because as this thing unfolds, we'll probably, things change oftentimes daily, certainly weekly, or a couple times a month. We want to be sure that we're keeping our focus on meeting our students where they are, and that has to be our core work as a Department of Education.
I agree, and I appreciate the partnership we have with the department on these issues. I think the things I'm speaking about are more of a legislative piece, because the one thing that kept going through my mind this past spring was that Cleveland Metropolitan Schools is going to be labeled as a failing school district. But what Cleveland Metropolitan School District did during this pandemic, and what they'll continue to do, is quite amazing. They were tracking down students to find out where they were so they could take food to them. And so they could make sure that they weren't being abused and that they were being hooked up to the services that they need. So they are integral to the lives of the children that they serve, but yet, based upon test scores, they may look like a failing school district. And that's something that needs to be changed in our accountability system.
Well, thank you, all of you. We have run out of time, so I apologize to those who added comments in the chat and we were not able to fully get through that list. Thank you to our panelists today. I appreciate John, Peter, Melissa, everything that you provided to this conversation, and then also to my colleagues who joined us and took time out today to have this conversation with us and hear our panelists, and of course all of you in the audience. We appreciate this discussion, and we will continue to have these discussions moving forward. I think our next panel is scheduled for 3 weeks from now, and I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Certainly lots of things to continue to both plan and again, flexibility and nimbleness moving forward. That it will be the theme, I think, for the remainder of, or for this entire school year. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.